Welcome to another episode of Bible Talk, the place where we connect the Bible and everyday life. I'm your host, Keith Farron, your Bible coach, and my guest today is Scot McKnight, professor, theologian, and the author of the new book, Revelation for the Rest of Us. And I want to warn you, anytime that a conversation happens about the book of Revelation, there are differing views. There are things that you wrestle with. And I've got to tell you that reading this book over the last few weeks has caused me to think about things, has caused me to ponder some things, has caused me to want to have longer discussions. And I think that this is going to be a book that I don't think I agree with everything that's in it. I don't think that a book that really makes you think is one that you're probably not just going to say, oh, yep, 100% everything. And we live in such a divided society where everything is, I 100% agree with this or 100% disagree with this, that I find that this is a book that causes me to think, causes me to pray, and causes me to want to pursue the Holy Spirit's discerning wisdom as I read the book of Revelation. And so I think any book that does that is a book worth spending some time in and chewing on and discussing. And so I was grateful that Scot agreed to come and sit down and have a conversation with me and with you. And so I really think this is going to make you think. This is going to challenge you and stretch you. But I really think you're going to enjoy my conversation with professor and author Scot McKnight. Well, Scot McKnight, thank you so much for joining me here on Bible Talk. I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you, Keith, for inviting me. Yeah. And I think our similar paths will lead to interesting questions.
I think so. Yeah, we've been around the same people, same denominations, on the same universities for a while, and but this is the first time we've had a chance to talk, and so I am grateful. Former guest on Bible Talk told me about your new book. I've read some of your older books, and I know you've written, a million of them. So as somebody who tells people that I've written just over 10 books, and they go, "Wow, that's a ton," and I meet somebody like you, and I'm like, all right, so I'm just getting started on this journey. But so your new book, I don't want to say is your most controversial book, but might be. And so it's a book about Revelation that always leads to, a book of the Bible that leads to a whole lot of differing opinions, a whole lot of struggle, and I just spent the last 2 weeks just pouring through this book, and has me thinking and asking. And so before we dive into the content of your book, give people a little bit of background on Scot McKnight. What's been your journey kind of vocationally, and where are you calling in from, all those kinds of fun things.
Well, we live in Chicagoland, the northern suburbs, and we've lived here since 1986 in the same house.
Wow.
And I'm a professor at Northern Seminary. I started as a teacher at Trinity. For 12 years, I taught seminary students, then 17 years at North Park University with undergrads. And while I was there, my life sort of took a shift toward seminaries, toward churches. And I wrote a few books that all of a sudden I was being invited to all kinds of churches. And so then I was offered an opportunity to teach at a seminary again, at Northern Seminary. And I took the job, and I'm now near the end of my 10th year at Northern Seminary. So I think the other day, we calculated that I've actually been teaching 40 years.
Wow.
So.
Wow. So it's been a while. While. Good. Yep. And I think I first became aware of you and your teaching and your writing when you were in your kind of early North Park days. I think is when I first, because I was a youth pastor during some of those seasons in the same denomination. So you've written Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. So what made you even want to tackle a book about Revelation, a book that you even admit in the beginning, early pages of this book, is one that people frequently either argue about or ignore.
Yeah.
And so what made you want, and your co-author
Yeah.
Cody
Cody.
Matchett,
Yeah. Yeah. He was,
what made you guys want to write a
yeah.
book about Revelation?
Cody was my graduate assistant when we started on this, and he wanted to do research. So we started doing research together on Revelation. By the time I taught a class, he was up to snuff on all this stuff. What made me want to? Well, I got involved in the book of Revelation when I was in high school as a youth. My youth pastor got me into it, but it was very dispensational. It was the days of Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth, but my pastor had me read Salem Kurband, who was sort of Hal Lindsey before Hal Lindsey became Hal Lindsey.
Okay.
And he wrote a little book called Guide to Survival, which was sort of a guide for people who didn't get raptured on what they were going through in the tribulation. So I read it and sort of bought it hook, line, and sinker, and just went on with it. Then when I was in college, it was a time in the early 70s. It was a time when there was lots of discussion about eschatology, the book of Revelation. And I got into the discussions about the rapture and changed my position from pre-trib to post-trib because of Bob Gundry, who was teaching at Biola, and discovered that I was in trouble with a lot of people because I believed that. And I just thought, well, this is what the Bible says, so I'm not too worried about you not liking what I'm saying. But really, after that, Keith, I lost interest in the book.
Hmm.
I had to take a class in seminary on that covered some of the book of Revelation. Then when I began to teach, I taught the Gospels mostly, and I remember giving lectures on Matthew 24, Mark 13. But then later in my years at Trinity, I would give lectures. We called it New Testament 612. We called the course The Leftovers, and that's the books that were left over after you had studied Jesus and Paul. And there was I think it was 2 lectures that I would give on Revelation. So I began to develop some ideas. Then I went to North Park, and at North Park, it just came up one day sometimes in our survey of the Bible class. All along, I was reading things, thinking about things, reading Jewish apocalyptic literature, thinking people have got this all wrong. They're saying stuff about dispensational stuff and speculation stuff and prediction. And is it Henry Kissinger? Is it Gorbachev with his birthmark?
Mm-hmm.
Is it who in the Bible? Who in the modern world is doing what in the Bible? 1948 was huge with the rebirth of Israel, and it had to be within a generation. And I remember thinking that's 1978 to 1988, and we got to 1988, and nothing happened. And I thought, this is just, there's something seriously misguided here.
Yeah.
So a student, actually one of my doctoral students, asked me if I would teach a course on Revelation. I said, I'd really like to, but I can't do it in the next year or two because I've already been spoken for the classes I teach. But then when I had freedom, I talked to Cody Matchett, and we started working on this together. And then I gave a series of lectures. And I would say, Keith, it was about the second or third lecture. We do just one lecture a week. It was in the evenings or late afternoons. I said to Cody, I said, this is going to be a book. There's stuff here that is not being talked about that can be repackaged. And so by December, and before the course was even over, I was already beginning to draft sections and chapters. And we started talking, and by the next summer, we had the manuscript done.
Yeah, and when you were talking about Gorbachev or whatever, I remember it was either high school or college, but I remember seeing something written up that proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that Prince Charles was the Antichrist.
I never heard that one.
Yeah,
Prince Charles.
yeah, because it was all of what were the four animals that were on his family crest
Oh,
insignia?
yes,
All these different. I mean,
yes.
they had all and the timelines
Four
and
horses
all
of
those
the
different things,
apocalypse.
and
Yeah.
so all these different. So I'm reading this, and you talk about how uh, the most people are reading Revelation with a dispensationalist, a predictive, a speculative kind of viewpoint, or as a lens they're looking at Revelation through. And you say that that's not the right way to read it. And so I've got kind of a two-part question of why is that not a good way to read it, and two, why is that really the most common way to read it if that's
Yeah.
not? How did it become
Let
so
me,
common if it's
yeah,
not a good way to read it?
let me say about the word common.
Okay.
It just depends who we're starting to put in our demographics. In the history of the church, this has not been the way people have read the book of Revelation, the common speculation approach today of dispensationalism. So, or new premillennialism, as Daniel Hummel's new book talks about. That's not been the most common, but it is very popular in the United States. And when you talk to America's evangelical Christians, that's the way they read the book of Revelation, because that's what they've been taught. And they've been taught this over two generations. Well, probably since the 60s and 70s, when dispensationalism experienced a rebirth through the works of people like Hal Lindsey and the Dallas Seminary people. Um, so I would say that's the common approach if you take that group into consideration. And it has influenced presidents like Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. But if you read Jewish apocalyptic literature, and there is a lot of it, there's 2 volumes of this stuff, that you can read. There is a lot of literature in the ancient Jewish world where they wrote books like this and imagined these bizarre images and God bringing justice in the world, and they were striking out against enemies and oppression and stuff like this. There's all kinds of this. Dead Sea Scrolls and Old Testament, what's called pseudepigrapha, all these writings are there. And when you start reading those texts, if you start reading them literally, you just get yourself laughed off the map. We would never think of reading Jewish apocalyptic literature as a literal prediction of things, but rather as sort of imaginative, um, somewhat fictional, fantasy type descriptions of bizarre situations, like dragons in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, with its tail sweeping a third of the stars. I mean, that is a huge dragon, and those
Yeah.
stars are bigger than the United States or the world, the Earth, and it's not possible. It's just sort of grotesque imagery, and it's not saying that it is completely fiction. It's describing something that will happen in the sense of justice coming and evil being eliminated and the people of God being rescued. Uh, and so I think that the speculative approach that we find that focuses, and Keith, this is the way I reduce it for my students, and it seems to work, and that is the speculative approach is always asking who in the modern world is doing what in the book of Revelation. So they see the book of Revelation as a bunch of predictions of what will happen in the future,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, let's say, an apocalyptic vision for first century Christians living in Western Asia Minor for how to experience the Roman Empire and the city of Rome and what it's doing to Christians at that time. Yes, there's an element of prediction. Of course, it's prophetic apocalyptic literature, but that it is predicting something 2,000 years or almost 2,000 years down the road, that's not possible. That's not what it's doing.
Hmm.
So,
Okay. So you just mentioned that this vision that John has for how Christians could live in light of Rome, in the shadow of Rome, and you speak of it being not only for that time, and not just being predictive that we should speculate on, But you use this phrase throughout the book where you keep coming back to Revelation is the story of everything. And I thought that
Mm-hmm.
was a fascinating phrase. Could you unpack what you mean by Revelation not just being predictive and not just being for the first century only, but being the story of everything?
Yeah, and one of the ways I do this is have people read just Revelation 12, the story of the woman and the dragon. It's like the whole book of Revelation in one little set of images. The story of everything is that it is from creation to the consummation of all time in New Jerusalem that will encompass the reworking, the remaking, the reestablishing of the world the way God wanted the world to be, that it will be just, it will be full of peace, wisdom, love. That that's what this book is about. This book is for people who long for justice, who long for peace, who want the end of war, who want the end of nonsense, hideous, evil shooting of children in schools. They want this stuff to end. That's what the book of Revelation taps into. It tries to convince people or persuade people and give images for people to see that someday God will remake this world and it will be a just world. That's the story of everything.
Hmm. Okay. And, and if we're gonna, because I thought that was a fascinating, that phrase frequently was in my mind as I was reading so much of the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And another kind of idea that you unpack in the book that I thought was interesting, and I'd love to hear kind of you verbally explain, is you speak of the how important it is to read Revelation with our imagination,
Yeah.
but that does not mean that it's just a work of fiction.
Yeah.
And so, what do you mean by we need to read Revelation with our imagination?
Yeah. Um, okay. Not just fiction in the sense of a Hemingway novel, but a little bit like the fiction of J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, that in Narnia, Lewis actually has sort of an eschatology at work, that at the
Mhm.
end, there's going to be justice and Aslan is going to rule the land again. That's the sort of vision that we have in the book of Revelation. But John appeals, all the time he uses the word I saw. It's coupled often with I heard voices in heaven. John sees things, and then he he has to, and I would guess that he saw these in a dream. He doesn't say it quite that way, but he had reveries where all of a sudden he saw these things. Then John has to decode what he saw or what he sees. He has to put words to that. And the words that he puts to it come from the Old Testament, the prophets like Zechariah, Ezekiel, Daniel, especially, Isaiah. He puts these things together in what he sees in words. And then when he writes it out, he sounds like the Old Testament so often, but almost never quotes the Old Testament, which is absolutely amazing. He's
Hmm.
so soaked in this prophetic literature that even what he sees, he can only describe with Old Testament prophetic language. And when this book is then read, this long book is read to the seven churches, and each one of them would have heard the book being read. I don't know how long it would have taken, but it would have at least been a long afternoon and evening. Um, the people who heard this didn't have copies of the book. They didn't have bizarre artwork about this book.
Mhm.
They they imagined as they heard it being read, when they start seeing this woman with 12 stars on her head, and they see a dragon with such a long tail to knock stars to the earth, and they see a war with Michael and the angels and his cohort against the dragon and his cohort in heaven, and Michael wins, and they toss the dragon, which is now defined as the serpent. The dragon becomes the serpent, and then they toss it to the earth, and this breaks forth into a heavenly choir of people praising the fact that now the defeat has occurred, salvation has come. The dragon or the serpent goes to earth and starts going after the woman and spews out of his mouth a river. That's kind of bizarre. Dragons don't have that big a mouth. And the earth swallows up all this water, and then the dragon gets so ticked off, or the serpent, he starts going after the children of the woman. Well, when you start seeing this, you're not sitting there thinking, well, there's actually going to be a dragon on earth who's actually going to swing his tail and knock stars to the land. Uh, no, it's meant for us to see the image. The descriptions are so good and clever and colorful, and even they have smell to them, that when we listen to this text being read, we cannot not think of what that looks like. And that's what you have to read the book well.
Okay. Yeah. And and I know that, I grew up with the conversation being, is the rapture happening before the millennium, before the 1,000 years, or after the 1,000 years, and what's
Before
the
the
rapture going to look like, and
tribulation,
who's
in
getting
the
left
middle of the
behind,
tribulation,
and all that. And
yeah.
so to try to wrap my brain around this, I'm sure that there are some people, quite honestly, I'm fully expecting that this will be an episode of Bible Talk, that there will be some people that will just get angry at me for having this conversation and stop watching. I hope that they don't. I hope that they watch, because as I read this and just started chewing on it, I don't even think, with all that I've been around the church now for more than 50 years, and thinking it's not like one book is going to be the end of the conversation. It's causing me to use my own imagination and even figure out what it is that I believe and why, and what's coming from the past, all these different things. But I I wanted to I should have probably started with this question. Why do you think the book of Revelation was written, like, uber high level? Why was the book of Revelation written, and why is it included in the canon of scripture? What's the purpose of Revelation? In just
Yeah. Well, Keith, I hope I don't get you in trouble with some of your
Oh,
listeners
you
and
will.
watchers.
I've been in trouble for years.
Okay. But all right, here's the thing. Paul writes letters. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they write gospels. Luke writes a chronicle of the early church. Even the word chronicle is not right. A history of the early church, the book of Acts. Other people wrote letters. No one else wrote an apocalypse. So you write an apocalypse if you want to apocalypse. If you want to do apocalypse is gonna apocalypse. That's what it does. And you write this kind of book when those other kinds of literature, genre, will not get the job done. And you write this kind of book because you're in a situation where you have a political power that is so corrupt that you cannot imagine being able to resist it in a way that could bring victory, but you know that God is going to have to do something to change the whole situation. So, an apocalypse is written in order to stir an audience into thinking that this world is big and it is dense. And what we see on planet Earth is not the full story. It's not real. There's a realer than the real that we see, and it's God's reality. So there's a way of describing this as a theopolitical hermeneutic, is that John gives his readers a way of thinking about the world, the Roman Empire, in ways that transcend their reality and make them think that someday uh, Rome will be defeated and the people of God will be on the winning team. So you write apocalypses when there's no other way to describe what God has to do. It is so outside the box that you have to go apocalyptic on him.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's okay. All
I
right.
mean, if you're a first century believer in Western Asia Minor, let's say you're in Smyrna,
Okay.
modern day Izmir, for John to tell you that Rome is going down and that you are going to participate in the New Jerusalem that will be over Rome is laughable. I mean, how many believers were in Smyrna in the first century? When John writes, maybe, I don't know, we'd have to guess, but 50 to 100. There's millions of Romans, and they have the military, the power, the boats, the money, everything, the death penalty. They have the courts, they have the gods, they have the temples, they have everything under control, and it's efficient. And you're sitting there thinking that your team's going to win. I mean, it's ridiculous. So that's why you go apocalyptic on them.
Okay.
It has to be.
And so, okay, so if that's the high level big picture of Revelation, that your subtitle is a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. So if that's the big picture of Revelation, and the purpose of Revelation is, if you will, to give this call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple, what do you mean by a dissident disciple? Just so
Yeah.
we're kind of semantics wise,
Okay.
we're on the same
Yeah.
page.
Remember this book of Revelation is written, it's very political. This book doesn't work if you don't think this is about Rome or some political power. It's about Rome, but some people don't want it to be first century Rome. So they want it to be Berlin, or they want it to be Moscow or Beijing or Washington, D.C. Okay, go for it. But John teaches his audience how to understand Rome. And the goddess of Rome, Roma is her name, and he flips the script from the goddess of Roma and makes her the whore of Babylon, which is extremely critical to do this, and turns Rome into Babylon and basically says Rome has fallen. Not it will fall, it has fallen. And so John wants the believers to have a completely different view of Rome. It's not the most efficient, the most powerful, it's not the most blessed country in the world. It's evil. It's full of corruption. It's an idolatrous nation. It is obsessed with opulence and accumulation and luxury. It is murderous. It is so image conscious that everywhere they walk in the streets, they're going to be reminded of the efficiency and power of Rome. It's a militaristic nation. The emperor, imperator in Latin, is the military victor in battle. So they're in a sense, for John wants people to say that the leader of your nation wears a military outfit, like Castro did. It's full of Rome is full of economic exploitation. It's arrogant. It cares about domination. That's what John wants to teach the believers to think of when they think of Rome. And John makes Babylon, he makes Rome, he turns Rome into Babylon because that's a famous Jewish city that oppressed the people of God, that they were in captivity there. And it becomes a trope. And I often say that Babylon is timeless. And that is, we need to be able to detect the presence of Babylon in the political powers of our day. Now, this is where you get in trouble as a pastor.
Right.
Is you if you're a true believer in the book of Revelation, and you don't want to just sit there and speculate about what could happen next, but read it as it's meant to be read, you become a dissident of political powers in the sense that you see the weaknesses and the corruptions of Washington, D.C., or Seattle, or in my case, Chicago, or even our local village. And it's not that you become a cynic where everything is wrong and you just want to find things that are problematic. No, you become um, a discerning, dissident disciple who can see corruption and evil in political powers because you've gained such a vision of New Jerusalem and the Lamb who is the temple of the New Jerusalem.
Hmm. Hmm. There's so much to chew on, and I did appreciate that as you walk through kind of the the characters. I mean, kind of looking at understanding not who is the beast or whatever in relation to the person of today, because that's exactly not the point, but understanding kind of conceptually Babylon and understanding beast, serpent, and under dragon and understanding the woman, all that. You've got it set up almost like a playbill, which I thought was a fascinating way to unpack that. But then there are conversations of looking at the kind of exactly what you just said about the political ramifications, first century through to today, and including tomorrow, of being that dissident disciple. And you have this quote in here that caught my eye. I marked it, and I even mentioned to you before we even hit record that just stands out to me. It says, "It's not our aim," because again, you co-wrote this with Cody. "It is not our aim to take sides among the two major approaches to Christian engagement in politics, conservative and progressive. Rather, we are urging Christians to comprehend what is happening in this cultural moment and find ways to discern the good and the bad on both sides." And I like that mindset and approach. And I found myself asking, how do we engage in healthy ways when, maybe I'm not even going to word this correctly, how do we engage in the political conversation, the political arena, political issues, discussions, when we see as dissident disciples Babylon on both sides?
Mm-hmm.
How, because
Yeah.
if we say, okay, if we're recognizing the good and the bad, if there's then therefore bad on both sides, how do we fight for things that we believe are good and right and true and godly and honoring of Jesus, and without being fully aligned with everything that is, when we're in such a you are either 100% Republican or 100% Democrat, or you are 100% you believe in this or 100% believe in that. And I don't know. I mean, I found myself contemplating the question of, how do we engage when there is Babylon on both sides?
Well, you're right, and the problem is the partisanship of the church right now in the United States is that it's made it extremely difficult to talk about a political topic. But I believe that we have failed the church for 50 years or more in not teaching a political discipleship. And a political discipleship cannot be taught from the book of Revelation if all you're doing is speculating about who's doing what in the modern world and fulfilling these prophecies. But instead, this book, and it lines up with all the prophets of Israel. And it even lines up with Jesus. Jesus can talk about Antipas and he said, "Go tell that fox." That's the sort of language of a prophet. Um, we have failed the church, and the partisanship of the American evangelical movement right now is the result of that failure. And we're going to have to start, and it's really difficult, Keith, and you're going to get in trouble. If I say something about Trump on my Substack, or I used to have a blog, I will get letters that I'm a liberal. If I say something about Joe Biden or Barack Obama, I get letters that I must be a right-wing nut, because people only think in absolute dichotomies right now politically, and that's sad. But it's the church's fault for Christians haven't been able to maintain a proper distance from partisanship and total allegiance to one party so that it can't speak prophetically for each party and against each party. And I think we have to model, you and I as leaders, have to model positive affirmations of let's say decisions in Washington D.C. or in our state and village, as well as critical statements, so that we don't give the impression that we align with a party, but that we affirm what's good and we speak up and speak out about what is corrupted. And I think that we're going to have to do this for an entire generation to flip the script that has happened in the United States in the last since Ronald Reagan, especially. But you could say it goes back to the post World War II generation.
Yeah, there's so much conversation that needs to happen. I think. Have you read? Not to talk about somebody else's book, but I think some of the conversations I've had with my friend Eugene Cho about his engagement. Do you know Eugene at all?
Yeah, I know Eugene. Yeah, when he
Yeah,
was
and
in
just
Seattle.
I just when it talks about engaging in politics, I just love the title of his book, "Thou shalt not be a jerk."
Yeah, yeah,
And then just kind of how do we
yeah.
engage in a bigger conversation than
But I
only.
think the issue is it's not just our manner and mode of conversation today, is that we have been discipled into partisanship rather than into a prophetic perception, a discernment. Like if we study Revelation 17 through 19, you get categories for discerning the corruption of political powers. We don't have that today. We're not speaking about big issues. We're talking about platform issues. And we need to develop a theopolitical discipleship that will allow us to affirm and criticize and not just spend our time trying to tone down our language, but developing an entire worldview of discernment so that we can see the corruptions that are in our world today.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So, yeah, I want to talk for hours about this and process. Um, so let's take a couple kind of big topics that get talked about in the book in conversations about the book of Revelation. One is the rapture, and is it going to happen before, pre-millennium, post-millennium? What is the rapture? When's it going to happen? And am I going to be escaping? and
Yeah.
then also the picture in the last two chapters of the book of the New Jerusalem and of the second coming, if you will. How should we think about those two? How, and we can take them one at a time, but
Yeah.
how should we process the
Well,
rapture and the conversations about it, and how should we think about the second coming of Christ? And
the rapture question, Keith, it all goes to one passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. I mean 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And a number of us who've worked on this text would say that that is not describing a rapture. I just got an email from someone who asked me if I believe in a rapture, and gave me some early Christian texts that they think teach that. But at any rate, what most people talk about with the rapture, they came out of the 19th century, 18th century, 19th especially. Okay, the rapture is an idea that the church, unlike Israel, the church which is destined for heaven, will be um, taken and removed from the earth before God resumes his work on earth with Israel in the tribulation of 7 years. So there's a debate among evangelicals who care about the rapture of whether it's a pre-trib rapture before the tribulation, a mid-trib rapture, somewhere around the middle, or a post-trib rapture, which is toward the end. And I remember in college learning it as a pre-wrath rapture was the idea of the post-trib rapture. Okay. And now, okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is this: the book of Revelation never brings up the idea of a rapture. It does have a rapture, but the only person raptured in the book of Revelation is Jesus, who is raptured to his Father in Revelation chapter 12. Okay, the Son is snatched. And Jesus himself never talks about the rapture in the Gospels. So there's only one passage, and I doubt very much that that's what that text is actually talking about. This has been discussed by people like Tom Wright, Ben Witherington, and I. I have a little commentary in the Everyday Bible series on 1 Thessalonians, and you can read what I say there. Okay, now New Jerusalem. Let's talk about the millennium too.
Okay.
Because in Revelation 20, the last 3 chapters are the way describing what's going to happen when Babylon is defeated and the dragon is tossed into the lake of fire. It's all over. So evil is defeated. Then we're going to have something beautiful. All right, the millennium. This is what is fascinating to me, is that many people read Revelation, they want it to all be a chronological order, and it just doesn't work that way. The book of Revelation has more interruptions than a bad speaker, a bad preacher who just can't quite stay on course. They have all these sidebars. Revelation from chapter 6 through, let's say, chapter 19 has so many interruptions and interludes. It's annoying to the one person who wants to keep it going.
Yeah, you have a whole section in there on the
Yeah.
interludes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So an interlude about the interludes. The millennium is very interesting. It describes 1,000 years, and it has saints who are ruling the earth. Okay, that sounds like an earthly thing, but here's the thing. It's only for martyrs. These are people who died in the tribulation. And if you want to call it that great tribulation of 7 years, and I have some doubts about whether we should look at it that way. I think 3.5 years means a short while. But nonetheless, what we say today about the millennium has nothing to do with what Revelation 20 says about the millennium. And what Revelation 20 says about the millennium has nothing to do with what people are saying about the millennium today. So it's really messed up. It's only for the martyrs, and it's very difficult to locate chronologically. I think it's a description that those who are killed for following the Lamb will be raised and will be able to rule with God during this time of until the second coming. And so I think it happens immediately. So there's all kinds of these people there. So, and deciding what your view is on the book of Revelation, of whether you're premillennial, postmillennial, or amillennial, is a distortion of the whole book, because it sort of uses a text that probably isn't saying what people are saying about it to sort of sort what people think about the book. So I don't like that. Now, New Jerusalem is the ideal city, and it's weird. It's a cube. It's just a cube. And it's really an odd shaped thing. I mean, are we going to have elevators, and how do we get up to the top if we're in the top rooms? But the idea is that all the wealth that Rome has exploited from people will all return to its proper use before God. And it will be a glorious city where there will be peace and justice. The gates will never have to be shut because everything will be safe. And everybody will have the food that they need. Nobody's going to have more than they need. There will be no more exploitation, no more war, no more murders, no more opulence. It's just going to be the ideal city. So in the book of Revelation, we have to get Babylon defeated so that there can be New Jerusalem. evil has to be eliminated so that the just society, the beloved community can be formed. It's that sort of story of everything.
Uh, I told I read most of this book as Carrie and I were, my wife Carrie and I were flying home, and oftentimes when I'm reading on a plane, I get tired, and so I get about an hour into my book, and then I turn on a movie or something like that, and I'm just reading. I'm just reading for hours as I'm poring over this, and every once in a while I'd be like, Carrie, this is what it's, and I just found that this was such a thought provoking read
Oh, good.
that it was something that is causing me to. I think I'm going to have to talk through this not only with you. Now that I have your email address, you might get really tired of me. But not only with you, but with other people I know that have thought deeply about this. I want to take my pastor out to lunch and process some of this with him. And I think that as we discuss these, I love books that force me to think from different angles and to have to reframe different conversations. I think that you know it's going to be a perspective complete changer for some, and I think it's going to be a perspective enlarger for all. I think that.
Well, that's what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, it's an attempt, in a sense, to help people learn to read the book differently than what they've been read. So it's sort of like, it's not a textbook. It's too easy to read for that. But it's we want to give people a different way of reading the book of Revelation.
Yeah, and mission accomplished.
Thank you. Thank you.
Scott, this has been great. I told you we try to shoot for like 20 to 30 minutes, and I think we're sitting at 45. So I just and I knew it. I knew this was going to go, and this will be one that I'll come back to. I look forward to. I think the next time I'm in Chicago, I want to buy you lunch, and we can have a longer conversation about this. And I just really appreciate you taking the time and investing in my community. And I pray that this conversation is helpful for people. And I really encourage people to grab the book and to pray through it, to discern,
I'm writing right now the Everyday Bible series book on Revelation. So I finished Revelation 12 this morning.
Wow. All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being here and investing this time and investing the amount of study and work that went in. Please thank Cody for me.
Yeah,
next time you talk to him. And I look forward to a conversation in person, hopefully sometime soon.
Thank you.
All right. All right, everyone. Well, that does it for this episode of Bible Talk, and we will see you next time.